The 24th of July, 1609. Somewhere in the Western Atlantic, a fleet of 9 ships sails into weather it cannot see the edge of. The flagship is called the Sea Venture. She is new. Her planking has not yet swelled tight, and by the second day of the storm, the seams have opened along her whole length. Water is coming in faster than men can throw it out. Sir Thomas Gates divides everyone aboard into 3 shifts and sets them to bail around the clock. The Admiral takes his turn at the pump. So does the Governor. In the hold, the ship's biscuit has gone to paste in the bilge water, and the paste is clogging the pumps from below. Someone thinks to press raw beef into the open seams. It holds. For a while. By the 4th day, the bailing has stopped. Sylvester Jourdain is aboard, and he will write it down within the year. The men commend their souls to God, and they sit down in the dark to wait for the ship to go under them. And then Sir George Somers, who has taken the helm himself, sees something on the horizon that should not be there. Land. In this part of the ocean, there is nothing charted at all, only a rumor. A reef-ringed island the Spanish call the Isle of Devils, which sailors have been steering around for the better part of a century because at night something out there screams. Somers does not steer around it. He turns the ship toward the reef and drives her onto it under sail, half a mile off the beach, and wedges her there between 2 rocks so she cannot slip back and sink. The Sea Venture never floats again. 153 people walk away from her. They come ashore on the 28th of July, soaked and shaking, onto an island that is green from the waterline to the ridge. Cedar forest, wild hogs left behind by some earlier wreck nobody recorded. Birds in such numbers that a man can take one out of the air with his hands. And then the survivors do what every castaway does first. They walk inland to find the river. There is no river, there is no stream, no spring, no pond, no lake, no waterhole that is not salt. The island that has just saved 153 lives has nothing on it a human being can drink. "416 years later, roughly 60,000 people live on that same rock. There is still no river. They solved it. And the answer they arrived at is sitting, this morning, on top of every single building on the island. This is Bermuda, a scatter of 181 islands in the North Atlantic, 8 of them stitched together by bridges, the whole chain adding up to 21 square miles, roughly the size of a mid-sized town. It lies 1,030 kilometers east of Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, and nothing else on Earth is nearer. It is not in the Caribbean. It is not tropical. It sits at the latitude of Charleston, kept mild by a warm current running past it, and it is the most isolated inhabited place in the Atlantic Ocean. It receives 55 inches of rain a year, more than England and Wales. And unlike most places at this latitude, the rain arrives evenly. No monsoon, no dry season, just a steady, grey delivery spread across all 12 months. None of it stays. Not one river, not one creek, not one freshwater lake on an island that gets rained on all year. So where does it go? The answer is underneath your feet, and it explains nearly everything about how people live here. Bermuda is limestone, but not the hard grey limestone of an English quarry. This is young rock, porous and pale and sugary, made of crushed shell and coral sand cemented by rainfall into dunes and then into stone. Water moves through it the way water moves through a sponge. Rain lands and is gone within minutes. It does not pool. It does not run downhill toward anything. It goes straight down through the rock until it meets the seawater that saturates everything below sea level. And there, something quiet and useful happens. Fresh water is lighter than salt water, so it floats on top of it. It spreads sideways and settles into a thin sheet a few meters thick, curved at the edges, shaped like a lens, which is exactly what geologists call it, a freshwater lens. There are several of them beneath the island. Around 750 million litres of rainfall recharge them every year. Roughly 3,000 households have drilled private wells down into them. But what comes back up is brackish. It picks up salt from the layer below and, in places, nitrate from the cesspits above. You can flush a toilet with it. You can keep a garden alive with it. You cannot put it in a glass. At Walsingham, near the eastern end of the island, the rock gives up its secret entirely. In 1905, two boys chasing a lost cricket ball found a hole in the ground and went into it. What they had found was a cavern 80 feet deep, hung with formations that took hundreds of thousands of years to grow, and floored with a lake so clear that visitors mistake the bottom for the surface. That lake is 55 feet deep. It is also tidal. It rises and falls with the sea outside, because the whole island is connected to the ocean through the rock, like a stone soaked through. Which is the point. Bermuda cannot hold water. The island itself leaks. To understand why, you have to go back 30 million years and about 4,000 meters down. Bermuda began as a volcano. Not a subduction volcano, not an island arc, a mid-ocean seamount built by episodic eruptions of basaltic lava through the floor of a much narrower Atlantic. It grew until it broke the surface, and at its full height, it may have stood 1,000 meters above the sea. That mountain is completely gone. The last major eruption was around 30 million years ago. After the fire stopped, the ocean started, and the ocean is patient. Waves cut the volcano down to nothing. By 20 million years ago, the entire volcanic island had been planed off flat, below the waterline, leaving a submerged platform in the middle of an empty sea. And then something began building on the ruins. Corals settled on the drowned summit. Algae, mollusks, forams, sea urchins, every one of them pulling calcium carbonate out of the water and locking it into a skeleton. When they died, the skeletons stayed. Over millions of years, that debris buried the volcano under a limestone cap so thick that the basalt now lies 35 meters below Castle Harbour and 115 meters below the western parishes. Everything you can see of Bermuda, every cliff, every cave, every quarried building block, is the compressed corpse of a reef. But a reef is underwater. Something had to lift Bermuda into the air. The parrotfish did. There are several species of them on the reefs here, and they spend their days doing something that sounds trivial and is not. A parrotfish grazes algae off the coral with a beak of fused teeth, and it cannot separate the algae from the rock underneath. So it takes the rock too, grinds it in a second set of jaws in its throat, digests what it can use, and excretes the rest as sand. A single large parrotfish can produce hundreds of kilograms of sand in a year. Multiply that across a reef system, across geological time, and you get an engine, a machine that converts a solid reef into loose grains at a steady industrial rate. Those grains washed ashore. Wind picked them up and stacked them into dunes. Rains seeped through the dunes and cemented them into stone. Then sea levels fell, more sand blew ashore, and the process ran again. 5 separate limestone formations. 6 buried ancient soils between them. During the ice ages, when the sea dropped as much as 100 meters, Bermuda stood exposed as a forested island more than 10 times its present size. Then the ice melted, the water came back, and almost all of it drowned again. What is left above the waterline today is about 7% of the platform. So the island is not a rock in the ocean. It is the last high ground of something much larger, made almost entirely by animals, held up on the stump of a dead volcano. And the same porous, thirsty stone that raised it out of the water is the reason nobody on it can find a drink. The survivors of the sea venture stayed for 10 months. They had been sent to rescue Jamestown, and Jamestown was 600 miles away and starving. So they salvaged what they could from the wreck: rigging, iron, timber, the ship's boat. And they cut Bermuda cedar, and they built 2 new vessels on the beach. They named them the Deliverance and the Patience. In May of 1610, they sailed for Virginia and found the colony they had come to save reduced by 70%. The winter the castaways had spent eating fish and turtle and hog on a green island was the same winter Jamestown had spent eating its own dead. 2 men chose not to leave. Christopher Carter and Edward Chard stayed behind on Bermuda, alone in the Atlantic, to hold the claim. By 1612, the first intentional settlers arrived, 60 of them, and founded a town on a sheltered harbor at the eastern end. They called it St. George's. It has been continuously inhabited ever since, the oldest surviving English town anywhere in the New World, older than Plymouth, older than Manhattan. And almost immediately, the town began to solve the problem the castaways had discovered. The first roofs were palmetto thatch because palmetto was what grew there. Thatch sheds rain. It does not collect it, and it does not survive a hurricane. Within a few decades, the settlers were quarrying the soft local limestone into slabs, laying them in overlapping courses, and sealing the joints with lime mortar. The stone was heavy enough to stay on the house in a 100-mile wind. It was cut from the same hillside the house sat on, and it did something the thatch never had. It caught what fell. Underneath, they dug tanks. Not wells, tanks. Sealed chambers, hollowed into the rock beneath the floor, plastered smooth, fed by a channel running along the low edge of the roof. Every drop that landed on the house went down into the dark and waited there. It is worth being precise about what this meant because it is easy to hear it as quaint. There was no aquifer to fall back on. There was no mainland to pipe from. 600 miles of open ocean lay between this town and the nearest alternative. If the tank was empty and the sky was clear, there was no second option. A family's survival was a direct function of the square footage of its own roof. Bermuda is the only place on Earth that was settled by accident and then had to invent from nothing the basic infrastructure of staying alive. And they did it while eating the island. The cedar forest that built the Deliverance and the Patience was one of the densest stands of Juniperus bermudiana anywhere. It went into ships, into houses, into furniture, into fuel. Turtles were taken until the government had to legislate to protect them in 1620, one of the earliest conservation laws in the English-speaking world. And there was the bird. The screaming the Spanish had heard, the reason the place was called the Isle of Devils, was not devils. It was a seabird, a nocturnal petrel that came ashore only to nest, that spent its entire life on the open ocean otherwise, and that flew back into its burrow in the dark, making a sound like a cry. The settlers named it for that sound. They called it the Cahow. They also found it was edible, unafraid of people, and nesting on the ground. In the winter of 1614 and 1615, during a famine, the governor sent men to the outer islets to take cahows for the settlement. They came back with thousands. Between the hunting and the pigs and the rats that came ashore from the ships, the bird was gone from the main islands within a decade. By the 1620s, nobody in Bermuda had heard that cry for years. It was assumed to be extinct. That assumption held for 330 years. Hold on to that. Out beyond the beaches, the thing that wrecked the sea venture is still doing its work. Bermuda sits at the center of a reef platform that extends about 10 kilometers to the northwest, the northernmost coral reef system on the planet, kept alive at this latitude only by the warm current running past. It is shallow, it is hard, and for 400 years it was effectively invisible from a wooden ship at night. More than 300 wrecks are documented in these waters. The reef is a graveyard. Which brings us to the thing most people think they know about this place. In September of 1950, a wire service story about unexplained losses at sea ran in American newspapers. In 1964, a magazine called Argosy published an article by a writer named Vincent Gaddis, giving the area a name that was easy to remember and easy to sell. A 1974 paperback took the idea global and sold millions of copies. And that is the entire origin of the Bermuda Triangle. Not a legend passed down by sailors, a magazine feature, roughly 60 years old, built on cases that were later checked. A librarian named Lawrence Kusher went back to the primary sources in the mid-1970s and found something ordinary and damning. Ships reported missing that had sunk in documented storms. Losses that occurred hundreds of miles outside the boundary. In one case, an accident that appeared in no local newspaper at all because it had not happened. The American Oceanic Agency's position is unambiguous. There is no evidence that disappearances happen here more often than in any other heavily traveled stretch of ocean. Lloyd's of London does not rate these waters as more dangerous than any other. Thousands of aircraft and vessels pass through every day without incident. What is actually here is a strong current that can turn calm water violent within an hour, a corridor that nearly every Atlantic hurricane passes through, and a hard, shallow reef in the middle of open sea, which was, in fairness, more than enough to sink 300 ships. It simply required no help from anything supernatural. The island has spent 70 years being famous for a mystery that was invented in a magazine, while the genuinely remarkable thing about it sat in plain sight on every roof. By the end of the 17th century, Bermuda had run out of options on land. Tobacco had failed. The soil was thin, the acreage was tiny, and the colony could not feed itself by farming. So it turned around and faced the sea, and became something no one had planned. The instrument of that turn was a boat. Bermudian shipwrights took a Dutch hull design and reworked it around the material they had. Bermuda cedar is light, it resists rot, and marine worms do not eat it. A cedar sloop could be built small. Most were 22 to 28 feet on deck and rigged with a tall raked mast and a triangular mainsail that let her sail closer to the wind than almost anything afloat. Contemporaries called it the fastest sailing vessel of its time. Its rig is now on essentially every small sailing boat in the world. It is still called the Bermuda rig. With it, an island of a few thousand people built a maritime economy that reached from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. Bermudian sloops carried sugar and rum and timber and turtle. They salvaged wrecks. They ran cargo through blockades. During the American Revolution and the War of 1812, they took prizes as privateers, and their speed was the whole business model. But the foundation of the fortune was not sugar, and it was not privateering. It was salt. 600 miles south of Bermuda lie the Turks Islands, flat, dry, and covered in natural salt pans. Every February, a fleet of Bermudian sloops sailed down and put people ashore. They stayed 6 months, raking salt out of the pans under the sun, while the ships went trading elsewhere. In autumn, the sloops came back, loaded the salt, and carried it north to the fisheries of New England and Newfoundland, where it was needed to preserve cod. Salt was the cargo that made Bermudian families rich. In some seasons, up to 1/10 of the island's men were away on the rake. The people doing the raking were, in very large part, enslaved. Bermuda's slavery did not look like the plantation slavery of Jamaica or Virginia, and the island has told itself comfortable things about that difference for a long time. There were no vast estates here because there was no room for them. Enslaved people in Bermuda were shipwrights, pilots, sailors, divers, coopers, house servants. They built the sloops and they sailed them. By the 1830s, roughly 5,000 people on this small island were owned by other people. It was not gentler, it was differently shaped. June 1730. An elderly woman named Sarah Bassett is taken from a cell in St. George's and carried to a place near the crossroads, in front of a crowd. She is known as Sally. She is mixed race, she has raised a large number of grandchildren, and 17 years earlier, she was whipped through the parish for killing livestock. She has been convicted of supplying poison through her granddaughter intended for a slave-holding household. The court sentence is not hanging. She is burned alive. The execution is deliberately public. It is meant to be watched, and it is meant to be remembered, and the authorities are explicit that the purpose is to discourage anyone else from doing what she did. It worked in the short term. In the long term, it did the opposite. Sally Bassett stayed in Bermudian memory for 3 centuries, as a curse, as a saying about hot weather, as a folk figure. And when the island finally began in the last 20 years to look directly at its own past, she was the story that would not let it keep pretending the system had been mild. There is a memorial to her now on the grounds of the Cabinet Building in Hamilton. And there was another woman, born into that same system about 50 years later, who did something Sally Bassett was never able to do. She wrote it down. Mary Prince was born enslaved in Bermuda around 1788. Her mother was a house servant. Mary was sold on the death of her owner, sold again at 12 to a captain at Spanish Point for £57, and at 18 sold again, and sent to the Turks' islands to rake salt. She stood in the pans in salt water for hours at a stretch. The salt opened sores in her legs that would not close. She described being beaten, and she described the specific mechanics of the work with a precision no one at the time had heard from that side of it. Her last owner took her to London as a servant in 1827, and there she did the one thing the law did not anticipate. She walked out. Slavery had no legal footing on English soil. Mary Prince found work with a couple named Pringle, and Thomas Pringle happened to be secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society. In 1831, her account was published in London under her own name. The history of Mary Prince was the first narrative of an enslaved black woman published in Britain. It went through 3 printings in a year. It landed in the middle of the parliamentary fight over abolition, and it made the argument unanswerable, because it was not an argument. It was a description. Emancipation came to Bermuda on the 1st of August, 1834. The island chose not to use the apprenticeship transition applied elsewhere. Freedom here was immediate. Nobody knows where Mary Prince died or when. She disappears from the record after 1833. The salt she raked had built the fortunes of the island she was born on. Her account of raking it helped end the system that put her there. At the far western tip of the island, where the land narrows to almost nothing, there is a piece of engineering that has no business being on a rock this small. The Royal Naval Dockyard covers the whole of Island. Breakwaters, basins, a fortified keep, storehouses with walls 4 feet thick, a clock tower with 2 faces, one showing the hour, the other showing high tide. Britain built it because it had lost something. When the American colonies became the United States, the Royal Navy lost every base it had on the North American seaboard in a single stroke. It needed a fortified harbor in the Western Atlantic, and there was exactly one option. Bermuda became what the newspapers of the day called the Gibraltar of the West. The people who built it were prisoners. From 1824 until 1863, convicts were shipped from Britain and held in hulks, decommissioned warships moored in the shallows, converted into floating prisons. Some 9,000 men passed through them. They were rowed ashore at dawn to quarry limestone and rowed back at dusk. The stone they cut came out of the ground they were standing on. Yellow fever went through the hulks repeatedly. Men who died were buried on a small adjacent island, and for a long time, nobody counted them carefully. So the same soft rock produced 2 different things at the same moment in history. In the parishes, it was being cut into roof slates by families collecting their own drinking water, a technology of independence. Out here, it was being cut by prisoners into the walls of a fortress that existed to project someone else's power across an ocean. The dockyard is a shopping and cruise terminal now. The keep holds a museum. The clock tower still shows the tide.
A short way east at Somerset Bridge,
there is a gap in the roadway roughly 18 inches wide. Spanned by a hinged plank 2 men can lift by hand. It is thought to be the smallest working drawbridge in the world. The gap is exactly wide enough to let a sailboat's mast through. Between the forts and the roofs and the roads, it is easy to forget that anything was living here before any of it. Almost nothing was. An island this isolated is a lottery for wildlife. To colonize it, a species has to survive being blown 1,000 kilometers out to sea, or rafted there on debris, and then arrive with enough of a population to breed. Most never made it. Bermuda's native land fauna is therefore very short and very strange. There is exactly one native land vertebrate that walks. One. It is a small brown lizard about the length of a finger, glossy, with a habit of freezing rather than fleeing, the Bermuda skink. It lives in crevices in coastal rock, eats insects and fallen fruit, and it has been on these islands far longer than anything with a name for it. It is also one of the most endangered reptiles in the world. Rats eat it, cats catch it, but the strangest threat is glass. A skink climbs into a discarded bottle chasing insects, and the smooth wall means it cannot climb out. Conservation officers have opened bottles on the shoreline and found a dozen skinks inside a single one. There are a handful of strongholds left. Spittle Pond, the island's largest nature reserve, holds one. The offshore islets hold others. Above them, in the spring, comes the sound that Bermudians actually use to mark the turn of the year. Around the middle of March, white-tailed tropic birds return to the cliffs. Locals call them longtails for the two ribbon-like streamers of tail feathers that trail behind them in flight, longer than the bird's whole body. They nest in crevices in the limestone cliff faces, laying a single egg on bare rock. They fly with a stiff, deliberate wing beat and then tip and drop and cut along the water. When the first longtail is spotted, it is reported. It is genuinely news here. Remember that they nest in holes in the rock. It matters later. On the eastern end of the island, past Harrington Sound, the road climbs towards some of the most valuable real estate in the Atlantic. Tuckerstown. Golf course, private club, deep water harbor, houses that change hands for tens of millions of dollars. It is the address in Bermuda. 100 years ago, it was a village. It had been settled since the 17th century, and by the 20th, it was remote, poor, and largely ignored by the rest of the island. Most of the land was owned by black Bermudian families who had been there for generations. There was a one-room schoolhouse. There was a small parish cemetery on a rise near the water. In 1920, a British shipping company called Furness Withy began investing heavily in Bermudian tourism, and it wanted this specific peninsula for a golf club and a hotel. The Bermuda Development Company was created to acquire it, and the legislature passed an act giving that company something remarkable: the legal power to compel the owners to sell. More than 500 acres, around 6% of the entire landmass of the country, transferred into foreign control. A petition against it was raised in July of 1920. It was signed by 24 people, almost all of them from a handful of related families who actually lived there. Most Bermudians supported the plan because the plan promised tourists, and tourists promised work. The land was bought at well under what the owners asked. Between 1920 and 1922, surveys valued it at $687 an acre. By 1944, the same ground was valued at $5,050. The families moved inland, many of them toward Devil's Hole. The last resident, a woman named Dinah Smith, did not go voluntarily. She was removed from her property by force in 1923. Afterwards, the former owners were barred from returning to Tuckerstown at all, including as visitors, unless they were granted permission to enter. There is a detail here that people who take the heritage walk always stop at. The cemetery stayed. The graves of the families who were removed are still on that rise, and the golf course was built around them. Descendants have described going to visit their ancestors and finding balls in the grass among the headstones, hit in from the fairway. There is no persistence lesson to draw from this. It was a transfer of land from people who had it to people who wanted it, made legal by a vote, and the ground itself is now a hazard on a golf hole. It is one of the three events that Bermudians will tell you shaped the modern island. The second one arrived quietly, in a shipment of nursery trees. December 1944. Near Harrington Sound, a man named T.A. Russell is examining a cedar and finds something on the needles he does not like. Under a magnifying glass, the branches are speckled with tiny white points, each with a pale yellow center. Every one of them is a scale insect, an animal with almost no body, fixed to the branch, drilling a proboscis into the wood to drink. There are two species. They have almost certainly arrived on ornamental conifers imported from a nursery on the American mainland, brought in during the wartime construction boom, and they have been inspected on arrival, and a few white pinpricks are effectively impossible for an inspector to see. Within a year, they are around Castle Harbour, Tuckerstown, and Walsingham. Within 3 years, they are on every cedar in Bermuda. It is difficult to convey what that meant, because the landscape it happened to no longer exists in any photograph most people have seen. Bermuda in 1944 was a cedar island. The endemic juniper made up well over 90% of every tree standing. The Department of Agriculture calculated an average of 300 cedars on each of the island's 13,000 acres. From a distance, the whole place read as dark green, with white roofs set into it. The trees turned grey, then the crowns died. Then the rest died, slowly, from the top down. Ladybirds were imported by the tens of thousands to eat the scale. It made no measurable difference. By 1953, the blight had essentially finished. Estimates of the total loss run to 8 million trees, somewhere between 95 and 99% of the national tree, gone inside a decade. Dead cedars were cut and burned, the timber was lost, so was the nesting habitat, and so were the insects that lived in the bark. Among the things that disappeared with the forest was a cicada. Neotibicin bermudianus lived nowhere else in the world and depended on the cedar completely. When the cedar went, it went with it. So did Bermuda's endemic solitary bees. The native bluebird population collapsed because it nested in cedar cavities. Bermuda in the 1950s is one of the very few places where you can point to a specific sound and say that it's stopped. Nobody has heard that cicada since. To replace the windbreaks, the government planted casuarina, a fast-growing Australian import that does not hold a hurricane the way cedar did, and that spread aggressively into whatever ground was left. The island that emerged looked nothing like the island of 1940. And there was one more thing changing at the same time. In 1948, private cars were legalized in Bermuda for the first time. The forest came down and the sprawl went out in the same decade. Which brings us to the third event, and to a Monday morning. The 15th of June, 1959. Bermudians wake up to find flyers pasted on telephone poles across the island. The flyers give instructions. Do not go to the cinema. That is all. Segregation in Bermuda was not written into a comprehensive legal code the way it was in the American South. It was practiced. Hotels, restaurants, and theaters simply operated on the understanding that black Bermudians sat in the balcony or did not come in. The people who printed the flyers had organized in complete secrecy. 18 of them, mostly young professionals and recent university graduates, meeting at a private house in Flats. They called themselves the Progressive Group, and they never gave their names, and there were hard reasons for that. Their parents' mortgages could be revoked. Charges could be invented. Crowds gathered outside the theatres with placards. Nightly rallies drew hundreds. Two speakers, Kingsley Tweed and Richard Lynch, who did not know who had organised any of it, held them. Nothing was broken, nobody was hurt. It took 2 weeks. By early July, the theatre owners announced the end of segregated seating, and hotels and restaurants followed. The boycott is generally regarded as the hinge on which universal suffrage in the 1960s turned. It happened 4 years after Montgomery, on an island of 40,000 people, organized by a group who kept their identities secret for decades afterwards. 36 years earlier, on the other end of the island, a woman had been carried out of her house by force so that a foreign company could build a golf course. The same country, within one lifetime. Today, most of the money on this island comes from something that did not exist here a century ago. Hamilton is a capital city of roughly 1,000 permanent residents. Front Street is a row of pastel Georgian facades with balconies over the harbour, and directly behind them stand the glass towers of the international insurance industry. Bermuda is the largest reinsurance market on Earth. When a hurricane hits Florida or an earthquake hits Japan, a significant share of the risk was carried here. One economist estimates international business now accounts for about half of the entire Bermudian economy. The island's GDP per capita is among the highest anywhere in the world. And Bermudians are leaving. Deaths have outnumbered births every year since 2017. In 2023, there were 622 deaths and 330 births to families with at least one Bermudian parent. And the gap is widening. Around a quarter of the population is now a senior. More than half of all job holders are over 45. 95% of taxi drivers are. Housing costs more than almost anywhere. Groceries arrive by ship and are priced accordingly. Young Bermudians go abroad to study, and a great many of them do not come back because they cannot afford to. So, the wealthiest small country in the Atlantic is quietly running out of the one resource it can neither import nor manufacture: people. In 1951, a 15-year-old schoolboy was invited onto a boat. The bird that stopped screaming in the 1620s had never entirely let go of the island. In 1916, a specimen was matched against fossil bones and given a scientific name, 3 centuries after it was supposed to have died out. In 1935, a fledgling flew into St. David's Lighthouse and was killed, and the body went to an ornithologist who did not know what to make of it. In 1945, another one washed up on the beach at Cooper's Island. 3 dead birds in 30 years. Somewhere out there, something was still breeding. In January of 1951, Louis Mowbray, curator of the Bermuda Aquarium, and Robert Cushman Murphy, a seabird specialist from New York, mounted a last search of the rocky islets in Castle Harbour. They brought along a local schoolboy who already had a reputation on the island for knowing birds. His name was David Wingate. They found 18 nesting pairs. The Cahow had been extinct for 330 years, and it was not. 18 pairs hidden in crevices on 5 bare rocks in the dark at the far edge of a country that had forgotten the sound. That morning decided the rest of Wingate's life. He studied ornithology, came home, and in 1966 became Bermuda's first conservation officer. And then he did something that only makes sense if you understand how bad the odds were. The 5 islets the birds were using were tiny, low, and eroding. A hurricane could take them. Worse, the birds were losing chicks, not to rats, but to longtails. The white-tailed tropic bird nests in exactly the same kind of rock crevice, and it is slightly larger. A longtail Entering an occupied burrow will kill the chick inside and take the hole. Wingate's answer was a piece of carpentry. He designed a wooden baffle for the burrow entrance, an opening sized precisely so a Cahow can pass through it and a tropic bird cannot. Then he began building artificial burrows out of concrete with the baffle built in. Today, around 85% of all Cahows in existence nest in a concrete box that a human being made for them. But burrows were only half of it. The colony needed somewhere bigger and higher to expand to, and there was nowhere because the main islands had rats, cats, dogs and pigs, and had done since the 1620s. So Wingate picked an island and rebuilt it. Nonsuch is 15 acres of scrub in Castle Harbour, 40 feet above the sea. He moved his young family onto it, and they lived there as the only inhabitants. He pulled invasive plants out of the ground by hand. He planted thousands of native saplings. He removed the rats and kept removing them. And on an island with no fresh water anywhere, he dug a freshwater pond. Then he waited, and things came back. The Bermuda skink, land hermit crabs, West Indian topshells, yellow-crowned night herons, the endemic white-eyed vireo. Piece by piece, Nonsuch turned into something Bermuda had not had in 400 years, a functioning example of what the place looked like before anyone arrived. He called it a living museum. It has not been smooth. In 2003, Hurricane Fabian tore out a large number of nesting burrows in a single night. Wingate retired in 2000. Jeremy Medeiros took the program on, and between 2004 and 2017, he ran the hardest part of it, physically carrying Cahow chicks from the islets to Nonsuch, timed so that the chicks would imprint on the new island, and years later, come back to it to breed. In 2009, a Cahow chick hatched on Nonsuch Island, the first in roughly 390 years. There were 17 or 18 breeding pairs when the recovery program began in 1960. There are more than 185 now, and around 450 birds in total. It is still the third rarest seabird on the planet. It still nests nowhere on Earth except this one archipelago. And on a winter night on Nonsuch, if the wind is right, you can hear the sound that gave the island its old name. Which leaves the thing you came here for. Fly over Bermuda at any altitude, and the first thing you notice is that the island is white. Not the beaches, the buildings. Thousands of them, scattered across every hillside, everyone topped with the same bright stepped geometry, so uniform from the air that it reads as a pattern rather than as architecture. That is not a style, it is a machine, and every one of them is running. Here is how a Bermuda roof works. The frame is pitched, and onto it are laid rectangular slabs of local limestone, overlapped like tiles and bedded in mortar. More mortar goes over the top and into every joint, and it is worked into a series of shallow, horizontal ridges running across the slope. Those ridges are the whole invention. 55 inches of rain a year does not arrive gently, it arrives in bursts, and a smooth, pitched roof in a downpour throws water off the edge faster than any gutter can swallow it. The steps break the flow. Water runs down, hits a ridge, slows, spills over, hits the next one. By the time it reaches the bottom edge, it is moving slowly enough to be caught. At the eaves, it enters a long concrete trough. A Bermudian will call it the glide. The glide feeds a downspout. The downspout goes into the ground. And under the house, cut into the rock, sealed and plastered, is the tank. The whiteness has a job too. The original coating was lime wash, crushed limestone, burnt and slaked into a paste, sometimes with whale or turtle oil worked in, and slathered over the entire roof once a year. Burnt limestone is strongly alkaline. As rain crossed it, the water dissolved a trace of the lime, and its pH rose, and that made the roof itself mildly hostile to bacteria. Today, it is usually paint. It is still white because white reflects ultraviolet light back into the water film crossing it, which helps sterilize it on the way down, and because a white roof keeps the rooms beneath it cooler in August. All of which would be a charming local custom, except for one thing. It is the law. The Public Health Water Storage Regulations of 1951 do not suggest that a building collect rain. They specify the arithmetic. The prescribed catchment area is 4/5 of the total roof area of the building. The prescribed tank capacity is 100 gallons of storage for every 10 square feet of that catchment. Build a house in Bermuda in 2025, and you build a reservoir under it. There is no exemption for taste, and there is no version of the roof that does something else. A typical household captures something on the order of 350,000 liters in a year, which sounds like plenty until you divide it by days. A 3,000 square foot catchment yields roughly 86,000 gallons across a year. Spread across 365 days, that is about 237 gallons a day for everyone under that roof. And that number is not an average you can exceed and make up later. It is a ceiling set by the sky and the size of your own house. So Bermudians live differently, in ways that are almost invisible to a visitor. Most homes have two separate plumbing systems: tank water to the taps, well water or salt water to the toilets. Washing machines are not installed in every apartment in a building. Showers are short, and children are taught they are short. A great many houses have a second, smaller tank purely for a dry spell. And there is no mains water for most of the island. There is no water bill. Each household is, in the most literal sense, its own utility company, and it knows, at any given moment, roughly how much water it has left in the ground beneath the floor. So what happens when it does not rain? Then you buy it. 6 reverse osmosis plants around the island push Atlantic seawater through membranes and produce around 13,500 cubic meters a day, somewhere near a quarter of everything the island consumes. The government pipes water directly to about 2,000 households, to the hospital and to parts of Hamilton, and holds 3 million gallons in reserve in a tank at Prospect. But the main way the water moves is by road. During a dry spell, as many as 40,000 people on this island depend on trucked water. The trucks fill at government works and drive it up to the house, and a hose goes into the same tank the roof feeds, and a family that has been its own water company for 300 years pays somebody else for the difference. Bermudians do not like it. Not because it is unsafe, and not really because it is expensive. There is a story people here tell in different versions. Someone in an office declines a glass of water because they have decided it is reverse osmosis, and are quietly certain they can taste the difference between water that came out of the sea and water that fell on their own roof. The distinction is not chemical. It is the difference between water you caught and water you had to be given. That is what the white roofs actually are. Not a color scheme, and not a quaint survival from the age of sail. They are the oldest, continuously operating piece of infrastructure on the island, invented within a few years of the shipwreck, written into law 3 centuries later, and still, in 2025, the front line of the water supply for 60,000 people who have no river. The reef made the limestone made the roof catches the rain, and the rain is the only thing anyone here has ever had to drink. There is a building in St. George's with no roof at all. They started it in 1874 to replace a church that had burned. Then the money ran out and the congregation split, and the walls went up to their full height and stopped. It is called the unfinished church. The arches are complete. The windows are complete. Grass grows on the floor, and the sky sits directly on top of it. It is the one structure on the island that catches nothing. 400 years is not a long time, and Bermuda has spent it learning the same lesson in 4 different subjects. The cedar forest took 300 years to grow back from the shipbuilding and 8 years to die from an insect nobody could see without a magnifying glass. The bird that named the island was gone within a decade of people arriving. The village at Tuckerstown was 5 generations old and was removed inside 3 years. Segregation looked immovable for a century and fell in a fortnight. Things arrive slowly here and leave quickly. That is the shape of the place. But some of it has come back, and the evidence is specific. Around 1% of the cedars survived the blight because they happened to be resistant to the scale. Foresters propagated from those survivors. Bermudians planted them by hand, under a government slogan that people who were children in 1973 still remember. The cedar is not what it was. The canopy is a fraction of what covered the island in 1940, but it is standing, and it is seeding, and in Hog's Bay Park, the grey skeletons of the dead ones are still there beside them. The Cahow went from 18 pairs to more than 185, and on Nonsuch, the pond that David Wingate dug on an island with no fresh water is still there, still full, still surrounded by the herons and hermit crabs and skinks that found their way to it. A man with no funding decided that the answer to having no water was to make somewhere for it to gather and then wait, which is, more or less, what the whole island decided in 1612. Bermuda has not solved its problems. The tanks still run low, the trucks still come, the population is still shrinking, the ocean is still rising against limestone that is only a few meters above it, and nothing about the next century is settled. But every roof on this island is still white and still stepped and still pointed at the sky, waiting for the next thing that falls. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.